Great. Welcome everyone to Follow the Money, Tracking Cash and Voucher Assistance, where we're going to be hearing about DI's excellent work in trying to do exactly that, and some of the sort of strengths and weaknesses of current data on humanitarian cash. We're exploring what data on humanitarian cash is currently available, what that data tells us, how to harness it to improve coordination, delivery, and programming of donors and implementing organizations. So we're delighted to be joined by a great panel. Unni's joining us from Kerala. Frederick, I'm guessing, isn't on a tropical beach. I'm in Brighton. I was just browsing the participants. I used to think at humanitarian cash events that I'd know most people, but I don't know most of you. So fantastic to see you all here. But I don't know you, I think, is a sign of age on my part, but also sort of the growing scope of humanitarian cash. To those of you I do know, hi Kevin. We've got a packed agenda, so I will crack on with a few housekeeping notes and then we'll get straight into it. So audience, please use chat box to introduce themselves, share sort of comments and thoughts. It's great to have a lively chat box, so do keep it moving. But use the Q&A box to ask questions and we'll try and make time for a few of those. We almost certainly won't get to all of them, so we'll monitor the questions and people from DI will do their best to reply to them after the meeting if you leave your contact details. The event's being recorded and will be made available on DI's website following the event. For this event, you'll be able to access closed captioning. Just click on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and choose show subtitles for captions. We'll post these instructions in the chat. Following this event, there'll be an opportunity to share feedback through a Zoom survey, which as ever, it'd be fantastic if many of you, as possible of you, filled in. That's it for housekeeping, and we'll crack straight on. So we're going to have some opening remarks by Unni Krishnan, who is a CALP Network board member and Global Humanitarian Director for Plan International. Over to you, Unni.
Thank you, Paul. Good day, everyone. I must begin with a confession that I'm not an expert on cash and voucher assistance. I'm a student of cash and voucher assistance. So I'm very much looking forward to listening and learning from each one of you, possibly including a vibrant discussion that might come up through the chat box. So that's one of the reasons why I'm here. We are actually living through very unusual times. In the beginning of this month, I was in Tumbes. It's a border town between Peru and Ecuador. And I was with some community groups, local government officials, and my colleagues from Plan International, who are responding to the refugees and the migrants arriving from Venezuela. There has been a steady increase in the number of children and refugees arriving from Venezuela in recent weeks. They walk for thousands of kilometers and arrive dehydrated, hungry, and some have sustained a trauma or traumatized. They have actually lost everything, and they said they need everything to rebuild their lives. Fortunately, in the border towns and elsewhere in Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia, most of the relief materials they are looking for is easily available in local markets. I myself could find it when I was walking around. When asked, the refugee families told me that absence of cash is what is stopping them from securing food, cloth, and other relief items. 7 million Venezuelans now live as refugees and migrants in Colombia and other countries. In terms of numbers, the Venezuelan refugees or crisis is at par with Ukraine. In terms of attention and funding, it is a different and sad story like the hunger crisis. As practitioners, most of you are familiar with the key needs and expectations of people impacted by humanitarian crisis. While there may be some needs that are context-specific, the fundamentals are universal and go beyond geographies. That is dignity, rights, compassion, solidarity, and trust. I believe these are the oxygen cylinders that run the big idea of humanity and humanitarian action, both in crisis as well as in other settings. Trust and dignity. One of the first things I learned as a frontline relief worker is about the power of trust to act as a catalyst to mobilize communities, and that trust and human dignity are inseparable. Dignity for some people is also about giving them options and choices and allowing them to take control of actions and decisions that impact them. I have seen the true magic that cash and voucher assistance can provide to boost choices as well as dignity amongst disaster survivors. We all have seen the phenomenal increase in acceptance, community acceptance of cash and voucher as a preferred option amongst disaster survivors in recent years. It's no rocket science. Imagine a scenario. Would you like to receive your next month's salary as a remittance to your bank account? Or would you like to receive it as a bag of rice, some vegetables, some oil, and other basic household items? However, despite this acceptance and relevance and the mercurial growth, as I would put it over years, I hear from our experts in CALP Network that there was a drop in the annual growth rate of cash and voucher assistance last year. They tell me that in 2019, the growth rate was 19%, and in 2020, it was 16%. Sadly, in 2021, growth was just 3%. It is absolutely critical that we analyze and diagnose what is behind this sudden slowdown and understand various factors influencing this drop. Is it because the people impacted by crisis are no more interested in cash and voucher? Or is it that there is a new and better modality around? Or is it a lack of political will amongst leadership in the humanitarian ecosystem to promote cash and voucher? Or is it a combination of all? Unfortunately, the forecast is concerning, and we are yet to see the worst of the hunger crisis. Consider a couple of amplifiers. Firstly, sanctions or restricted movements of fertilizers from Russia and Ukraine is resulting in a drop in consumption and higher fertilizer prices. This means reduced harvest in 2023. The overall hunger situation could deteriorate further. Secondly, there is less donation available to charities, and when it is available, its value is decreasing. Cost of living crisis, higher energy bills in Europe, all mean less donation to charities. With regular donors considering cutting back, donations and higher inflation mean reduced value. 100 euros in 2021, some experts say, may be worth just less than 90 euros in 2024. It's not just food that cash and voucher assistance is addressing in hunger zones. During my last trip to Ethiopia, a group of women from Tigray told me that they were using parts of the cash and voucher to buy sanitary items for young girls because such items were not coming through or were not sufficient enough in relief package. So if you pan the camera to other major emergencies such as the hunger crisis and Ukraine, needs assessment and feasibility studies tell us a simple truth. In some contexts, up to 80% of the people, especially women and adolescent girls, prefer cash and voucher as a tool to address their basic needs. So cash and voucher as an assistance has emerged as a preferred choice for disaster impacted communities. With forecast for next year being even more pressing, it is absolutely critical we analyze and understand the factors influencing cash and voucher assistance uptake and put urgent remedial measures if this is something we can tackle. I wish the function all the very best. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for listening.
Great, thank you, Unni. Such a human and magisterial overview. And Nicholas, over to you.
Great, thank you very much for this introduction, Unni, and thank you, Paul, for opening us up. Let me just find the right screen to share, and I hope everyone can see the full slides. Is that correct? Great, thank you all, and welcome also from my side and from DI side to this presentation. So DI has been working on tracking humanitarian cash and voucher assistance since 2016, and felt that it was about time to take stock on whether the publicly available data on cash and voucher assistance has kept up with its growth in the humanitarian sector. So, there we go. We tried to address three main questions in our research. The first one is what the most recent data on cash and voucher assistance tells us about its use in humanitarian crisis responses. This is about the who, which types of agencies are implementing it, the where, in which countries is it happening, and to what extent, and for what, in terms of sectors, clusters, and so on. The second question that we asked in our research is, how is this data currently captured on interagency reporting platforms? And this goes back to minimum reporting agreements, which were agreed by members of the former Grand Bargain Cash Workstream in 2020. And based on those agreements among signatories, the criteria that we're looking for was whether data was publicly available on the volume of transfers, whether that data is disaggregated by cash and by vouchers, and reported with a sectoral objective. And finally, we are presenting some recommendations on how the reporting on cash and voucher assistance could be improved. So firstly, if we look at data that is collected annually by DI and the CALP Network, and Unni already just referred to it in his opening remarks, we find that while the global volumes of humanitarian cash and voucher assistance increased for the 6th consecutive year in 2021 to 5.3 billion, this small 4% increase on 2020 values is the smallest year-on-year increase that we've seen since we started to collect this data back in 2016. And according to agencies' self-reports, this might be due to consolidation in cash and voucher assistance portfolios following large increases in 2020 during the COVID-19 response. And also it should be noted flood response, with the government already having disbursed twice the amount of social assistance to flood affected families compared to what the response plan has received so far. This presents an important data gap. So if we look behind this global data and drill deeper on the country level, we find that there's a lot of variation in the share of funding requirements for cash and voucher activities across some of the largest response plans in 2022. And we can see these sort of dots appearing, and that ranges from 9% in Sudan up to 40% for the Ukraine flash appeal. And is precisely in this kind of country-specific data where the key lies to understanding the trends of humanitarian cash and voucher assistance. The requirements for multipurpose cash in Ukraine are the largest out of all of the plans at $1.7 billion. Given the large expansion of this response, and given that for plans with historical data on funding requirements for cash and vouchers, those have remained stable, we therefore anticipate that the global volumes will increase further in 2022, largely driven by the Ukraine response. Now, where does some of this country level data come from, given the data that we collect annually to try and paint a picture of global volumes only requests global total figures by organization? And this has been the entire discussion around the minimum reporting requirements, has been to generate granular, comparable, and publicly available data on cash and voucher assistance. And the largest amount of this data currently comes from UN OCHA's projects module, which collects information on the share of project funding requirements for cash and for vouchers. Unfortunately, this data is only available for response plans that go through a project registration process. So this puts the data availability in perspective. So given around a third of funding is outside of response plans, another third is to response plans without this project data, this leaves us with a final third of global humanitarian funding where this data is available at the granular level. And given the granularity of the data of this sort of dark yellow square here in terms of cash and voucher assistance, this allows for analysis by clusters over time and within different contexts. And that's something that we are going into in our report. Or as we will see on the next slides, it also provides information on the state of localization of cash and voucher assistance within response plans. So if we analyze the project level data or across 19 response plans, we find that in 2022, 97% of funding requirements for cash and voucher activities is made up by international actors, and only 3% by local and national NGOs. It should be noted that in this graph here, the significance of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement is not accurately reflected in terms of cash and voucher assistance, given it's based on UN response plan data and the movement tends to operate outside of those. But when we combine this data on requirements with funding data, we find even more things. For instance, that international actors were more than twice as likely to report to receive funding for cash and voucher projects compared to their other projects. Local and national NGOs, however, were only 7% more likely to be funded for their cash and voucher projects compared to their other activities. And this then raises the question to what extent there's a tension between humanitarian commitments to increase the use of cash and voucher assistance and those commitments to localized funding. But currently, the data to hold 2/3 of the humanitarian system to account on this is not publicly available. So following from this, we make some key recommendations on how the availability of data can be improved to be more accountable to some of these commitments. And apart from the global tracking platforms, our research also looked at the availability of cash and voucher data at the response level. Often this tends to be collected by cash working groups, but we found that this data is rarely timely, except in a few cases such as the Ukraine or in Somalia, or made fully accessible. And our first and foremost recommendation was therefore to seize the current opportunity through the new cash coordination model and clearly assign responsibility for who should track cash and voucher assistance within the new model, and to make sure that this is done in line with the minimum reporting requirements that were agreed by the Grand Bargain cash workstream. And this is to establish a standard process to ultimately obtain timely and comparable data that can support these coordination efforts. We also saw that currently most of the granular data on cash and voucher assistance is available through projectized response plans. So this data should be kept up to date, and funding should always, where possible, be linked to those projects, where currently that's only the case for around 60% of funding to those projectized plans. This then creates a mismatch between the rich data that's available at the project level on delivery modalities and on the funding data. And our final recommendation relates to the IATI standard, which introduced in 2019 the agreed requirements by the Grand Bargain cash workstream to track cash and voucher assistance, but those reporting possibilities are hardly used to date. So far, I think it's only been 4 NGOs that have published any data on cash and voucher assistance to IATI. So organizations that are already publishing project information to the International Aid Transparency Initiative and that implement cash and voucher assistance, which includes some of the largest players in the humanitarian cash and voucher space, such as WFP, UNHCR, IFRC, many international NGOs, should make use of those possibilities to incorporate that data on cash and voucher assistance where they already have existing reporting processes into IATI. So just to end on some thoughts in terms of next steps. Firstly, we thought it might be worthwhile to give a very brief reminder on the benefits of tracking and improving the tracking of cash and voucher assistance at the interagency level. So already mentioned on the recommendations on the previous slide was the need for timely and more granular information to support coordination efforts. And I'm looking forward to hearing from Frederick on the panel on how learnings from the data collection efforts on cash in Ukraine might inform on how this data is useful. And a second benefit is greater accountability through better public data. And this is not only to actors that have committed to increase cash and voucher assistance where appropriate and feasible, but also to make sure, as we've seen on one of the previous slides, that those commitments don't run counter efforts to localize humanitarian response. The issue of localization then neatly links to the next point, which is the need for better systematic consideration on how to link the data on humanitarian cash and voucher assistance transfer volumes to data on social protection in crisis contexts. There are some practical and conceptual challenges with this. And again, I'm looking forward to hearing thoughts on this in our panel discussion. And finally, we should also note that we should not focus too narrowly on cash and voucher assistance, but to extend the tracking discussion to other modalities, because ultimately this would be required to create more transparency and accountability around whether and how all humanitarian assistance is reaching those most in need. And yeah, thank you very much for sticking through this. And I believe that our research is now available online on our website in case you'd like to delve a bit deeper. And yeah, back to you, Paul, for thoughts from our panel.
Thanks, Nicholas. Yeah, someone in the chat asked if the slides will be available, which I assume they will be, but there's also a report which has all of this in much more detail and is now up on the DA website, so do go to that as well.
Yeah, and also to note, sorry, we will be, probably not this, but it's on next week or the week after, also be making available the data on the projectized response plans. So whatever we can make public of the data we analyze, we will also share on our website.
Thanks, Nicholas. That was masterfully kept to time. Obviously, there's a wealth of detail that you went through there, and so, hard to get hold of it all. But there's much more detail in the report, and people can read that at their leisure. We've got a fantastic panel that's going to sort of reflect on this, and we'll ask them some questions in a bit. So we've got Ryan Beach, a Program Policy Officer at the World Food Programme. We've got Frederick Atenega, Information Management Officer at OCHA. Caitlin Tullock, who's the Associate Director for Best Use of Resources at IRC, and Chloe Desoy, who's a Policy Officer on Cash Transfers at DG ECHO. Apologies for anyone who's...
Thank you, it's fine.
And over to you for reflections. Chloe, as you're sort of on screen, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Paul, and thank you also for, I'm very happy today to be part of this panel, especially because DG ECHO was actually co-leading the sub-work stream of the Grand Bargain on tracking CVA together with CALP. So really happy actually to see also that development initiatives is ensuring scrutiny to make sure that to check where we are at with this. And a first reflection is that it was a really some tough discussion at the time under the Grand Bargain with donors, partners to agree on some recommendations and to have minimum requirements, as it was said. And it's difficult to say to see that not much progress has been made, but on a positive line, I think that I'm very happy about the recommendations, in particular the one of citing the opportunity of having the new strategic coordination model, which is something we are actually starting to work on as the Donor Cash Forum. So we'll be following this closely. Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe. Frederick, over to you.
Thank you so much, Paul. For me, I think that was also very an exceptional presentation by Nick, highlighting the core challenges that surrounds the NPC data collection. I think also about stressing the fact that or the importance of triangulating at the interagency level and the granularity of the data set. But also to add to that, we could somewhat from experience also have some political challenges, and I think also there is a strong need for more engagement, with stakeholders to get their buy-in at whatever strategic approach, SOPs or systems we are trying to promote to implement cash and voucher assistance in whatever context. So for me, I think this event will really head in the right direction to improve CVA programming globally. Thank you very much, and over.
Thank you, Frederick. Ryan.
Hello, everyone. Yes, Ryan from the World Food Programme. Yeah, I'm incredibly happy to be here. I think this is an important topic. It'll be really interesting to see how we can employ a more systematic approach across all of our countries that ultimately arrives at supporting all of us to design our programs so that we're reaching more people in need, preventing overlap in different types of assistance where that matters, and also being able to evaluate the overall impact of our assistance and the degree to which we're actually changing people's lives and strengthening national systems. So I think that's what we're looking for, and are happy to contribute to. Thanks.
Thanks, Ryan. And Kate.
Thank you so much, Paul, and to Nick for that really excellent presentation. I want to echo Chloe in saying it's really interesting to see how this has evolved since this kind of tracking work kicked off in 2016. how much the sector has evolved and also how much the measurement and our ability to know what's going on in the sector has evolved. I think there was one piece that really stuck out to me, and building on the conversations that we had in the cash tracking working group of the Grand Bargain, which is about the different levels of granularity or specificity that are available at the project level compared to the response and kind of funding level. And I think that's really important for our kind of community to reflect on, because ultimately the purpose of all of this data is to enable action, some kind of decision making on whether, as was mentioned, there are obstacles to the large scale delivery of cash at the sector level and what those might be, or what we can learn for planning individual responses. And I'm seeing questions in the chat about how do you do this tracking? How do you raise these issues? I think it's really important for us to think about what kinds of lessons we should be asking to learn from different sources of data. And unfortunately, because we can't perfectly match the holistic data at the funding level to the individual project data, we're going to need to look in different places to learn different things, at least until we have a perfect tracking system that captures every dollar at, you know, both the project and the funding level. So that was my major reflection, was just the richness of the data, but the need to be a little bit disciplined in thinking about what questions we take to different data sources that are available within this really rich system. And I think the biggest conclusion that I took away from the presentation on, at the very highest level, what is the growth rate of cash, is about the slowing growth rate. And given the growth in needs, and particularly I think the kind of effect that the Ukraine response will have on these numbers in total, that's a really important result to highlight and to reflect on what's causing that. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Caitlin. And just to echo your point about the sort of how far we've come in a way. So before this started in 2016, I was part of a panel on humanitarian cash. That I think the report was in 2015, so presumably the numbers were from 2014. But the figure we came up with in that panel was a guess. You know, I knew roughly what WFP and UNHCR had done. I could make an educated guess about how much the Red Cross had done the previous year in humanitarian cash, and I completely guesstimated NGOs, and we came up with 6%. And it's you know, it's nice to see the growth of cash since then, albeit slowed in the previous year. But it's also great to see far more effective reporting. So although there's lots of gaps in the data, that it has come along a fair old way. On that note, I will hand back to you, Caitlin, who's going to talk about cost efficiency in cash programs and how we can make programming improvements from more sort of granular analysis of some of the data around cost.
Great. I'm going to also see if I can successfully share my screen. You can tell me if that has worked. I'm assuming it has, unless somebody's going to shake their head. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to join and talk about some of the work IRC has been doing. Within the Grand Bargain cash workstream, I think there were kind of sister tracks, one on tracking cash and vouchers and the other on value for money. But they were always very closely related because ultimately we're dealing with very similar data. The question here is, if we look at, this is the cost transfer ratio, this is what's usually used to assess the efficiency of cash programs. Most of what we've been talking about today is the amounts being transferred to clients. And the question then you can add on top of that is, well, how much in other programmatic costs, the targeting, the delivery, the monitoring, et cetera, did we spend in order to deliver that cash? And unfortunately, that's one of those kinds of questions that, I mean, Nick, I think probably spent a good year or more of his life trying to assemble these figures out of the very high level data, is very, very difficult to do and requires a number of assumptions. And so a group of NGOs has been diving into the more granular project level data to see if we can understand what this cost efficiency typically is, just descriptively, we don't really know. And then what causes it to vary across different responses, contexts, types of response, etc. So we're building here on a data set on cost efficiency of humanitarian CVA programs. We've currently got 25 individual data points. You should think of each of those as one project. So this is that very, very small scale data that I was referring to earlier. It is not holistic by any means, but it lets us get specific enough to measure this cost efficiency ratio well. And that's pulling from 3 NGOs, anywhere we could find publicly available data that was sufficiently detailed and transparent that we could basically verify that they were measuring this efficiency ratio consistently. And so the efficiency is one part of this. We're interested in knowing how much is it costing us to transfer. But beyond that, we also assembled a lot of secondary data on what's the scale of these individual programs? How long did they last? How big were the transfers? How did targeting work? Which took a lot of time, but really was key to this because it let us ask a number of questions about what is driving the efficiency of cash and voucher assistance programs. I've included a couple of regression tables here. If you are not a research person, you can just ignore the right portion of my slides. I know not everybody will be interested in that. But the number one result that really is coming out of this data set is that cash and voucher assistance programs get significantly more efficient. It costs us less for every $1 we transfer to clients when they are run at larger scale. But interestingly, those returns are decreasing. It's not that every time you get a little bit bigger, the cost to deliver per dollar goes down. Actually, a lot of these gains are captured once you pass a fairly small threshold of about 1,000 households within one program. And this has been a really interesting result because I think intuitively everybody kind of suspects scale is important. I think we say it often. I think people at the IRC are really tired of me saying it to them. But there's a very practical point here, which is you don't have to push for infinite scale to capture these efficiency gains. And actually we can, thanks to this data, identify a fairly practical threshold that says we need to avoid running programs that are smaller than this. We need to try and consolidate our cash programs. And that will allow us to make best use of those investments we're putting into targeting systems, post-distribution monitoring, etc. So that's the number one result that comes out of this data set. But there's some concern that these are actually very different programs in very different places. And in particular, the price levels across these 13 countries, if you remember the map, are very different. And so the country's price level could affect that efficiency ratio, mostly through the size of transfers. When you look at the data in this set of programs, I think the transfers run anywhere from $50 per household per month up through almost 300. So that's a really big range. And if the denominator of your efficiency ratio is changing by 6 times, that's going to have some big impact on cross-country comparisons. When we look at this, we saw how much efficiency changed based on the minimum expenditure basket, so measure of the price level, and the transfer size itself. Both of them clearly are significantly related. The efficiency tends to be higher. The cost per dollar transferred is lower in countries where the price level or the transfer size is bigger. And again, I don't think this is a groundbreaking result. I think everybody kind of intuitively gets this. What's interesting is being able to quantify that. And so for instance, we can say that all else being equal, a program in East Africa would have a cost transfer ratio 50% higher than the equivalent program in the Middle East, based solely on the difference in the MEBs and transfer size in those places. So that's, again, a fairly practical tool we can take because that leads us towards this idea of context-sensitive benchmarking. Rather than saying every program everywhere, we expect to be able to cost precisely this much, there's some sense of how much distortionary effect the different cost transfer ratios in different places have on that. And again, what I really like about this data set is that it's not based on, I myself am not a cash expert, I'm an economist, it's based on the decisions and the actual experiences of all of the programs in this data set. This is actually what they were able to achieve with a given amount of resources. So that's another key result that comes out of this. I think there's some question of actually are these two things moving together? Maybe it's the case that we run really large scale programs in the Middle East because for many years there was a lot of funding for cash in and around Syria. Same is true for Ukraine now. And also those are contexts where we transfer a lot of cash. So if you look at basically, if you control for both scale and price level, the impact of those things, increases in scale, change in the size of transfers, on the cost efficiency of the program stays pretty much the same as what I showed you on the previous two slides. So that gives us confidence that actually these two things are quite important, even when you're controlling for a number of other characteristics. And then the last thing to mention from these results is that no other program characteristics that we looked at, not targeting method, not transfer modality, not any of these other kind of number of rounds of cash or so forth, make any detectable difference in the cost efficiency of these programs. I think it's important to say detectable difference because this is not a giant data set. This is not, big data, machine learning type stuff. But what we can say is that, from 25 plus programs, we don't detect a big enough difference from these other features. And that I think has also given us some fairly practical conclusions to take away, which is I'm sure that those other things influence the efficiency of response in individual cases. But we can start to prioritize what we're going to focus the conversation on if we're worried about the efficiency of cash and vouchers assistance. And it's really these two features, one of which is bound by context. This is the price level and the transfer size. And the other is scale. This is more directly under our control if we're designing a new program. And so I think there's two real results coming off of this. One is, as I mentioned, the programmatic guidance about scale. But the other is the possibility of context-sensitive benchmarking. And you can imagine using these numbers, if you felt like looking at them a lot, to say, what's the predicted efficiency of a program that reaches 1,000 households, given the transfer size in Uganda, in Ethiopia, in Ukraine? And that, I think, has some nice potential for thinking about benchmarking going forward based on the real kind of lived experience of humanitarian CVA programs. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Caitlin. And again, great keeping to time. So we're going to go to a sort of moderated panel now where I'm going to ask the panelists some questions and then we'll get to some of the questions that we've had in the Q&A after that. Ryan, I'm going to start with you. And clearly, when you look at the sort of overall global volumes of humanitarian cash, WFP is an important part of that. It's delivering large amounts of humanitarian cash. Given that you're an important part of the sort of data landscape, how are you thinking about sort of sharing and coordinating and collating that data, and also what data do you find most useful to inform your own policy and programming around humanitarian cash?
Okay, yeah, thanks. There's a lot there because data can include a lot of things. But I would say, so how we typically participate is at the local level in all of the cash working group forums. We're actively participating and sharing the information that's been agreed to there. So that was my point about if we're following a more systematic or standardized approach globally, that might help also as we start to aggregate some of this at a global level, which we do internally in WFP, related just to the sheer volume and figures for who we're reaching and at what scale in each country. But in terms of what we generally make publicly available globally, it's really a lot about around our vulnerability and analysis data that our team in HQ is producing about markets. So it's a lot about prices and currencies, currency fluctuations and volatilities, which we find is actually what is incredibly important for the practitioners in the field, and that type of analysis isn't something that our colleagues and others in the field are typically able to do. I would say also in the initial stages of an emergency, We have had good experience with working with partners to coordinate also at the beneficiary level. And what we're trying to do here is really to prevent the overlap of assistance, just to make sure that we're able to reach the most people that we can with the available resources. There have been a lot of programmatic and technical challenges around doing that, because it does require everybody to agree on common standards for kind of what we're collecting and how we're going to share it and what we're going to do with the outcomes of that, especially when we are finding clashes in terms of different agencies assisting the same households. So how we disentangle and adjudicate those types of issues is something that is very operational. It takes a lot of effort, but it is showing good results. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it's great. Thank you, Ryan. And I mean, it picks up on what I was going to ask Frederick. So, as you were saying, Ryan, we sort of a lot of this is done at the local level through cash working groups. Lacking up till now has been a clear sort of body at the global level to sort of collate and coordinate that data. So, we've ended up with CALP and DI doing this work. We are now about to have a new cash coordination model. Frederick, any thoughts on sort of what OCHA's vision is for where data fits in the new cash coordination model? And we've also been hearing about Ukraine, which is unusual in having well-reported, seemingly more accurate than normal real-time data on the cash response in Ukraine. So also any thoughts about what we can learn from that Ukraine response and where we can take it in other crises which are less well-funded?
Thank you very much, Paul. I think these are two interesting questions. I will try my best to do justice to it. If we look at the excerpt, let me start with the first question that has to do with the role of or the vision of OSHA in the new cash coordination model. If we look at the excerpts from the recently published cash coordination model, which was, you agree with me, was the outcome from the Grand Bargain Cash Coordination CACUS endorsed in March 22 by ASAC. I think UN OSHA was given the responsibility for cash coordination at the country level, and also sharing at the ICCG, that is intercluster coordination level. And the sole approach, looking at the ASAC settings, was to ensure predictable and accountable mechanism for cash coordination. Earlier in Nick's presentation, he also emphasized on timely decision as needed, giving clearer accountability. I think from OSHA standpoint, we are fully in support of this approach of the new cash coordination model. And we have nothing less than that same vision to support these principles and settings. But we're taking it a step further, looking at 4 core items. One is to consistently support and promote the use of cash as a modality in the wider humanitarian space through training, capacity building in LCG meetups, and of course during the ICG. Because over time we've seen that this has a form of improving the adaptability and the use of cash and voucher assistance. Secondly, strategically, we are also looking at various approach that is people-centered, need-based approach, inclusivity, and of course, very quality response. When Nick was also presenting, he mentioned a centralized data model. From the standpoint of OSHA, we're also looking forward to see that joint tools are efficiently harmonized, and of course, not excluding the inclusion of social protection and social cohesion. You agree with me if we go to the fundamental of cash and voucher assistance. There are also various risks involved in cash and voucher interventions. We are also, one of our visions is to see how we could mitigate this risk to the barest minimum. Another core vision of OSHA as related to this is looking at the strong capacity that we have in terms of information management. And of course, you agree with me that we cannot rule out information management in terms of coordination. They go side by side. So we are going to be focusing in core innovations, adapting to the technological trend. You agree with me just from the presentation from Kotlin, where machine learning was taken into account. We could also take this further, looking into artificial intelligence in forecasting those various intervention processes in terms of gaps on how to improve coordination and support CVA intervention. Another point I could stress here has to do with introducing what we call the task force or task teams. This is to efficiently also strengthen coordination. We could look at targeting, and these were things we also did in Ukraine, where we harmonize the assessment form based on commonly agreed vulnerability criteria. We also looked at delivery mechanisms, registrations, and including various applications that could support deduplication. We had a very fantastic application, which is a building block from WFP. We also had various supporting tools in terms of monitoring. I think I'm going to stop here in terms of the first question. Going to your second question on...
okay, briefly, Frederick, because we need to get to the other panelists too. So be quick on the second question.
Oh, fantastic. Sorry. Okay, I'll try to summarize this. The second question, please correct me if I'm wrong, has to do with how we successfully had a real-time consolidation of the cash and voucher assistance data sets in Ukraine. Let me just go straight to the point. I think the idea was born or bettered from the very basic definition of what a computer is. If you recall, it's garbage in and garbage out. So what we defined was just a very simple template, and I will just share this with you for free. First, we developed a very clear work plan, and secondly, because of time, I don't want to talk on each of the points. Secondly, we had a very clear information management catalog developed, which include expected information product and production workflow, including storage point and dissemination and timelines. Thirdly, we had the buy-in of stakeholders, including the government before rollout. Fourthly, we got to work and we were consistent in what we were doing, including training and capacity building, which was happening on a weekly basis. And lastly, we had a very different season where we had to evaluate our various approach and see where we need to improve and get back to work again. I would just stop here on a very lighter note with this quote, saying that it is very clear that for us to be able to see gaps clearly and motivate people to share data for an improved coordinated approach, we need to start irrespective of the level of data that we have. So I'm going to share this quote with you and I will stop talking. It is an imperfect product that most often results in the emergence of a perfect product. So start from the scratch. Thank you very much, and over. Thank you, Fred.
And then we can there's been a huge amount of issues raised by everyone, and we can come back to them a bit as we get to the Q&A from the wider audience.
Fantastic.
So turning to you, so I mean, ECHO, as I understand it, is about possibly to make a sort of further funding allocation in response to the floods in Pakistan. You could choose there to fund WFP, you could choose to fund IRC, you could, if your regulatory framework allowed it, choose to fund national actors more directly in line with localization commitments, but you'll be struggling to. How, if at all, would sort of better data on humanitarian cash enable you to make those funding decisions in Pakistan or elsewhere?
Thank you, Paul. Yes, for us, so as I mentioned earlier, it's really key to have better data. And a point that I would like to make actually is also the distinction between cash and voucher. So as DG ECHO, we've been, really trying to have this distinction, and we're really glad to commit to have this common commitment on the distinction between cash and voucher. And unfortunately, it's still, the reporting on so far in this panel, we've been really speaking about CVA. And our new policy on cash transfers focus really on cash transfers and not voucher, and that's for many reasons in terms of the flexibility that is given to beneficiaries, but also efficiencies among other reasons. And so I think that's really part for us of that's really an important point I wanted to raise. And also in terms of data, I mean, in terms of efficiency, it's really important for us to have more transparency. And yeah, we cannot fund, unfortunately, local actors directly because of our institutional framework. And we are, however, very committed to localization, and we are trying to really support our international partner to scale up, their support to local actors. And we are actually developing a guidance that will be published next year on localization to be more transparent also on what we are doing to support that. Yes, I think really we do use the data tracking in our assessment of proposals for this efficiency question. So yes, that's very important to us.
Thanks, Chloe. Turning, I think, to some of the questions in the Q&A. A few of them, Caitlin, I'm going to get you to take this one first. A few of them have been about sort of, how useful is cash data without sort of comparable data on in-kind assistance. And I guess for Caitlin and or Nicholas, I mean, do you think the data we're talking about at the moment on humanitarian cash would be more powerful if sort of put side by side with data about in-kind assistance, and how might we get to that? Caitlin and then Nicholas on that.
So for many years, this was actually the focus of most efficiency and cost effectiveness analyses of cash. And I put a reference in there to a very nice 3IE review that looked at all impact evaluations, comparing them. And then IRC has also done a report just comparing cost per dollar transferred of cash versus in kind. I think in large part, those very high level findings that in pretty much every case, cash was more cost efficient, i.e. there was lower delivery costs for every $1 of assistance that goes to clients. And then on top of that, cash has this additional benefit in terms of dignity and choice. That is a pretty universal finding for basic needs. There's more evaluations ongoing right now of things like food assistance. And are these things equally cost effective in terms of nutritional outcomes? So I don't want to overstate that. But I think that is actually a relatively well understood question from the data, and more evaluations are ongoing. Given that, I think the value that we see in this kind of more granular data is in saying, okay, well then how are we going to deliver cash? For instance, when I actually first started at IRC, cash was the first cost efficiency analysis I ever did. And I looked at a bunch of NFI programs and a bunch of cash programs. And if you averaged them up, actually our cash programs were not more efficient than our NFI programs. And I was very worried that like something was broken or I had done something wrong. And this is actually what led us to this finding about scale, is that when you hold scale constant, cash is more efficient than in kind per dollar transferred to clients. But actually in the early years of IRC's cash response, we went from running these giant NFI programs that we've been doing for decades to these really tiny kind of experimental pilot style programs. And we were undercutting the value that we could be delivering through cash because we were just saying, well, NFIs versus cash, A is better than B, so just switch. And then all of the practicalities hung us up and forced us to do these small scale programs. So this is where I would say you can make that comparison, but you also need to think about how these things are delivered. And that finding that, you know, holding scale constant, cash is a more efficient way to get assistance to clients, gives us a really, really strong, you know, strategic priority, which is we need to find ways to get our cash programs to the scale at which we have historically delivered NFIs. So I see those two things actually sitting side by side with each other quite nicely. One is, what are you going to do? And then the question is, how do we need to do it to ensure that we're getting the most assistance to our clients?
Okay. Nicholas, did you want to comment on that? Or I also want to ask you a question about sort of the social protection side of things. Do you want to comment on this one, or should I skip to that?
No, happy to skip to the social protection.
Okay. So, I mean, it's a question I've kept asking Nicholas in various forms, but it's good to do it in the public one. So, I mean, I've been looking at Pakistan and Sri Lanka a bit recently, and their humanitarian cash, frankly, is sort of blown out the water by you know, social protection provided by the government, supported by the World Bank, but being used for emergency response. And so partly it's a tracking question, you know, how do you think we might include some analysis of those things in the sort of humanitarian response to crisis, but that don't sit within the current tracking of humanitarian cash? And then I've got a sort of provocative question for Chloe after that, but over to you, Nicholas, first.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, I think it's a tricky one in terms of the agreeing on criteria on when social protection assistance through social protection systems to people in humanitarian or to people in crisis context is classified as humanitarian, and then the second question of how to count that up. But yeah, we briefly sort of touched on it in this research, just by, you know, when noting that we don't have the in consideration of this for the most part in the global data that's currently available. And part of that issue is just, you know, the focus of interagency reporting platforms, you know, that we have. So, you know, financial tracking service by UN OCHA, that's primarily there to track an interagency like humanitarian response, and actually explicitly does not want to include, you know, what governments do domestically. Same with the International Aid Transparency Initiative. You know, I don't think there's cases of, you know, governments reporting their domestic expenditure to those. So it kind of seems like there is a need for kind of, you know, taking that into account systematically, probably at the country level, just because the differences between, you know, targeting criteria, how social protection mechanisms work, and how much information is available on those disbursements just varies so much by country. To just try and sort of build this more systemically into the monitoring that happens by the cash working groups, to have that as part of the standardized information output on what are the cash transfers in this country, alongside, you know, what's happening in terms of the social protection response by the governments to the same communities. Yeah, I think that's sort of the, you know, off the top of my head when sort of musing over this research. But, you know, I think it's a big question, and, you know, as I said, I think the differences across contexts are pretty substantial. So I think there's quite a lot more thought that this deserves.
Yeah. So sticking, well, I guess partly with that. So you talked a bit in your presentation, Nicholas, about sort of potential tensions between commitments around humanitarian cash and commitments to localization. And the grand bargaining commitment around localization is more direct funneling directly to national and local actors. And so in the very early days of discussions around humanitarian cash back in about 2005, ECHO had a ceiling on what could be programmed through cash of, I think, 150,000. So they used to say in meetings I went to, we can do humanitarian cash just as long as the total program value isn't 150,000. And I used to make points at that scale that kind of limited you in terms of scale. And you said, yeah, that's true, but it's against the rules, so we can't shift them. It would involve, too complicated legislation in the European Parliament. It's not going to happen. And eventually you did make it change because it was plainly daft. At some point, if your regulatory framework doesn't allow something, you might need to change the rules. And I'm wondering if you think that applies to localization and ways in which you can more directly fund national and local actors in relation to humanitarian cash.
Thank you, Paul, for this question. So indeed, our legal framework doesn't allow us to directly finance, local actors, and this is not going to change. This is like a top-level decision, and yes. So the short answer is no. However, we do support, that's part of our new cash policy, that really, the nexus is at the top of the policy, and the support towards shock responsive social protection system is really important. So yeah, maybe to highlight that we have three entry points on this. To how to support social protection system. One is really to pilot design on operational features to facilitate the transition of a program or caseload into a social protection system. A second entry point is to link with existing social protection system at different points of the delivery chain. And the third one is to contribute to the adaptation of shock responsive social protection system on programs during period of fragility, conflict, or forced displacement. And I think that what really matters a lot is the context. So we really see different, level of nexus in this approach. So it could be, if it's an acute crisis, a protracted crisis, forced displacement, we would see really various ways of supporting social protection from the cash perspective. Yeah, I think that's very important for us to highlight. And so we are not directly funding governments. We are always going through our partners, but the way we are advocating, on the way we are pushing, will really depends on the maturity of the system. And that's it's really nice to see that in some contexts like Somalia, we've been able to really, start working on social protection thanks to the humanitarian aid assistance, where the system was really weak. So yes, that's really a work that is very important to us.
Thanks, Chloe. I'd love to argue the point of view a bit more, but I'd be abusing my position as moderator more than I already have. We're coming towards an end. I'm conscious that I've been doing my best to have a look at questions in the Q&A, but I probably haven't got to them. So I think I'll start handing over to the panelists for final thoughts. Do answer questions in the Q&A that you've seen but I've missed. Just pick your favorite. Ryan, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, thanks. I think my reflection is, and this is something that we've arrived to over the last few years in WFP, is that really the selection of a transfer modality is a strategic design choice as part of our programs. And so we really want to focus on the overall impact that we're bringing to people and families, and how to set up the transfer modality that really promotes our strategic objectives and empowering people. So for example, we're really focused on financial inclusion of people, getting more money in the hands of women, more accounts in the names of women, and making sure that vulnerable groups are not left behind. So our focus on analyzing data these days is really about determining the programmatic insights that might help us to improve our program design. And so, of course, there's a lot of data that we mine just from the mechanics of our operations, but also the qualitative data is super important and super interesting. So for example, things that we're getting from focus groups, that we hear from people, the complaints and feedback mechanisms that we have set up, putting in the mechanisms to triangulate that against the other types of quantitative data that we have and are analyzing is really about telling that overall story about how we're impacting people, making sure that we're listening to them, we're hearing their stories, and that's how we're designing our program. So that's what we're working on now. Yeah, thanks.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. Caitlin, and then Frederick, and then Chloe, and then Nicholas. So you know what order you're in.
I think the one thing I want to kind of pull on from a number of the questions that have been put in the chat is about, and this is taking me back to the many, many conversations we had in the Grand Bargain Working Group, but about how you think about the efficiency ratio, and then on the one hand, what goes into it, on the other hand, what decisions you make with it. I think the thing I would really emphasize here, I started off my comments today by mentioning, you need to think about what you can realistically learn from any given set of data. And even this more granular set of data we have here is very, very limited. We're looking at efficiency, we're triangulating it with a couple of other key program characteristics to see if we can tell what makes the most difference. I think one of the big lessons we've learned is that IRC internally doesn't set benchmarks in terms of cost that people have to meet, because there are so many risks associated with that, as people have been calling out in the Q&A. And so that for us is important. And honestly, one of the roles that this data has played at IRC has been enabling us to go to leadership and saying, look, if you set this benchmark, you're going to rule out doing cash in these 5 countries. You're going to rule out services to this segment of the population, and actually demonstrate with data why those kinds of benchmarks are not what IRC wants to be doing as a whole. But I think the role that they do play is in letting us say what makes the greatest difference in the proportion of our assistance that goes to clients. Ultimately, this is not about reducing costs. This is about getting as much of the assistance as possible into the hands of clients. And then everything beyond that, everything that doesn't rise to the top of these regression tables, is just not best addressed by this set of data. And so I think you have to really think about, again, the use of data in the context of wider decision-making. We can discern what are the most important lessons, the most important things. I think similar to the higher level results, where we're really seeing clear trajectories in terms of the growth rate of cash, this question about the percent to local actors. Regardless of measurement issues, there are a couple really clear lessons. And the same is true for the efficiency data. Everything beyond that should be determined by the people working in the response, who know the needs of their population, the available modalities of delivery, and all of this. One nice thing this data can do maybe is to take efficiency out of the conversation in other places and say, look, this is why there are people on the ground who actually know much better than me with my Excel spreadsheet what should be done.
Thank you, Caitlin. Frederick, we've got 3 minutes left, so you're going to have to be brief in your final thoughts. So let's give Nicholas a bit of time to have the final word.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Thank you very much. I think reflecting on some of the questions on the chat, I'll just put together in summary some of my thought, and that is to also support timely reporting of the data, because information lag is directly proportional to bad response, if you ask me. In other words, our information products with regard to CVA, MPC, modalities, etc., should be one, people-centered, rightly show the progress of indicators monitored, and of course, importantly, highlight the performance of humanitarian partners, because this same data actually comes from them. So if you don't showcase what they are doing, most likely you won't get this level of accuracy of data. And on the final thought, if we go back to the basic 10 guiding principles of CBA CVA developed by ECHO in line with the principles of good humanitarian donorship and fair code of conduct. We'll find out that two things were also highlighted strongly was innovation. I think we should most often think outside the box in terms of CVA and NPC modality, et cetera, And number two, I think very preeminently, we should always ask ourselves before any cash intervention, the why not cash? I think it's going to solve a lot of issues in terms of mitigating also the risk that come alongside CVA interventions. Thank you very much, and over.
Thank you, Frederick. I had bold visions of finishing exactly on time, but I haven't quite managed it. Chloe, if you've got anything burning coming now, otherwise we'll hand over to Nicholas for final thoughts.
Thanks. That's fine for me. I mean, I think I highlighted the most important points. So over to Nick.
Yeah, thank you. I think my main hope is now that with the new cash coordination model and the whole transition plan, that this would breathe some life again into the whole discussions of getting timely and high quality data that's comparable across cash and voucher assistance. Because, I mean, from having had conversations with some colleagues at the country level and with some cash working groups, I just find it very hard to imagine how the system will be effectively able to coordinate without the availability of that data on, who does what where and who's being targeted. We can see some of this happening, in the Ukraine with building blocks and so on and so forth. These models in place to make sure that this works going forward.
Great.
Thank you.
One of the benefits of running slightly over is I don't have to think about too much to say in wrapping up remarks. So I won't. I guess, I mean, two final thoughts. One is, there are always frustrations with sort of where we've got to on data. There's always ways in which it could be both more timely and more sort of effective in informing decision making. But we honestly have come quite a long way in quite a short period of time since I was looking at it in 2015. So sort of kudos to DI and the team for where they've managed to get to with this data. And do read the report and look at where it is. I think it's been really valuable hearing from Caitlin. What I took from it particularly was sort of caution around benchmarks. Whilst benchmarks can be a really important sort of tool for driving things at different levels, you need to have well-informed benchmarks and be careful about sort of perverse incentives around benchmarks. So that's applies both sort of within agencies and across agencies and with donors. On that note, huge thanks everyone. Sorry and apologies for people whose questions we didn't get to. We'll try and prod Nicholas to answer some of those and the other panelists. And do obviously get in touch with us if you have burning questions that we failed to answer, and feedback to Nicholas on the report. Do fill out the Zoom survey about the thing so that DI can meet their metrics around the brilliance of their meetings. And we'll look forward to staying in touch with all of you as CALP and OCHO and its new cash coordination role and all of the actors here take forward their humanitarian cash programming in different ways. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And congratulations to development initiatives. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. Bye.